Now, Michigan manufacturers don't want special treatment. The unparalleled product of hardworking men and women in Michigan speaks for itself, but I think we can all agree they deserve a level playing field. We know what happens when they're unfairly disadvantaged. Jobs are lost to overseas competitors. Investment in jobs is delayed or canceled. We need to ensure Michigan families find jobs that pay the bills, provide economic stability, and allow them to save for the future. We need to make sure you can achieve the American dream. Let's get started with the calls, and let's go to Eric Klein in Birmingham. Eric, are you with us? Okay. Let's go to Julie in Troy.
Hi. Hello. My thoughts are I'm very disappointed in the confirmation of Betty DeVos, and I know you have protesters outside of your office in Troy. Can you tell me what prompted you to vote for her, where you thought she had qualifications to do the job?
Well, Julie, thanks for calling in. I'm in the House of Representatives, so unfortunately I did not get a vote on Betsy DeVos's confirmation as Secretary of Education. That was done over in the United States Senate today. But President Trump, I think, has the right to assemble a team and a cabinet that he thinks will accomplish his agenda. There's no question that Betsy DeVos was one of the more controversial choices. But I am concerned about education in our country, and I think she will be providing dramatic change to the Department of Education, which I think is necessary to make sure that every child in our country has the opportunity to get a quality education. There's a lot of problems with schools around our country, and there's no question they need more money and more support. But we also need an accountability from the teachers and the administrators to make sure that the kids are always put first. And I think Betsy will do that, but we'll see how it plays out. But again, the Senate confirmed her today, and I think it was the closest vote in the history of any cabinet appointee, 51-50. They needed the vice president to break the tie. But I appreciate you calling in. Let's go to Rosie with your question.
I do not agree with this confirmation of DeVos. She has no clue. It's very political. I'm very shocked that you would support that. And the agendas I'm seeing, you need to represent more than the Republican point of view in dealing with this. Trump is an embarrassment, a bully, and that's not how we govern in the United States. This is not an authoritarian presidency, which is where it's headed. And hopefully you will watch out and move forward if he does anything illegal, impeachable.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts and input, and there's no question a lot of people didn't agree with the DeVos choice. And we will be holding the president accountable, and there are a lot of people in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, who after 8 years of President Obama, who really felt like the legislative branch was marginalized and Article 1 of the Constitution was ignored. So we expect better treatment from President Trump, and we'll certainly look for results from both Betsy DeVos and the entire administration. Let's go to Betty in Birmingham. Thanks for calling in tonight.
Okay, I'm on?
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, it's not a question, it's a big thank you. I've never before in my life felt that I knew what was going on in Washington as much as I do now. And I really want to thank you for all that communication. I read all your emails and pay attention. It's a big thanks. The question is a very simple one, and you maybe have already answered it. Had you been in the Senate, how would you have voted on DeVos?
Well, I would have voted to confirm her. And as you know, out of 52 senators, Republican senators, there were 2 that voted against confirmation. I do believe the president has the opportunity, and if you look at the advise and consent power in the Senate over the years, it was never nearly as contentious as it is today. By and large, absent just egregious ethical or criminal conduct, the president's cabinet appointees were confirmed, regardless of who controlled the Senate. It's become so partisan today. I do think the president, having won the election, has the right to put his team in place to accomplish his agenda. and so I would have voted to support her. But I appreciate your feedback on feeling, that you're connected. One of the problems with, being in Congress is you're here in Washington so much, like we've been this year, and you feel like you don't get home enough. The positive news, I guess, is there's a half a dozen, news channels that spend 24 hours a day telling you what's happening in Washington, and some people get sick of it, but hopefully it makes it feel like people are connected to what's going on. And let's go to Mary in Auburn Hills.
Hi, Congressman.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for calling in tonight.
Well, thanks for taking my call. I just had a couple of comments. I wanted to echo the previous caller, that I do appreciate the communication that you provide. Your office is always available if I have questions. But mostly I wanted to tell you to support the President and support the Senate in the Mrs. DeVos's confirmation today. It's very important that we do something different. Our education system is just as broken as Washington. And half the people want her out of there, and half the people are supporting her. I just hope that even though you didn't have the opportunity to vote for her confirmation, that you would support her and my president.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the feedback. And, one of my feelings about our education and the Department of Education is something I know that Betsy DeVos will work on, which is we need to push more responsibility, more of the decision-making, and more of the money out of Washington and down to the state and the local levels. And there are exceptions to that. There are school districts around the country where there's abuse and overt, criminal behavior where people are stealing money, embezzling money, and that's certainly a time and place for the federal government to step in and make sure that kids' educations aren't suffering because school districts are doing unethical or criminal activity. But by and large, and certainly in my district, the school districts do a very fine job with the resources they have, and we need to get Washington out of the way and let the school districts make more decisions. And it's really like all politics is local, like former Speaker Tip O'Neill used to say. I mean, on our education, when you have parents who are concerned and show up at a school board meeting and express their concerns, that's where really things get done. It's not when you write letters to the Department of Education here in Washington. So thanks for the question. And we're going to do a few poll questions throughout this call tonight. So if you'd like to participate, it's pretty simple. And we start out with a very general question. Do you think the country is headed in the right direction? You can press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, and press 3 for undecided. And in a few minutes, I'll report back to you with the results. Let's go to Neil in Troy. Thanks for calling in.
Your response has been registered.
What would you like to talk about?
My question is about the replacement for the Affordable Care Act. And I'd like to know what you think is an important in a replacement. And if you think that the spending on uninsured needs to continue via Medicaid expansion specifically.
Right. Well, it's been certainly a very controversial issue for us in Washington since we got back here in January. And the whole repeal and replacement is someone mentioned earlier, I think is a part of the reason why there have been protests in our district office. And here are my thoughts on the Affordable Care Act. So, it was doomed to fail on so many levels. It was rolled out without any really outside input from different groups that have expertise on healthcare issues. The 9 doctors in Congress, including Democratic doctors in the House, weren't sought for any input from the Obama administration. It was rushed through because the Democrats were worried they were going to lose their supermajority of 60 senators with the health problems surrounding Ted Kennedy. So it was rushed through. Even Nancy Pelosi acknowledged when they voted on it that they hadn't read it, and they would read what was in it after they voted on it. And then they started working on the rollout of the website for people to sign up and spent $2 billion, and we all know that launch of that website didn't go very well. So that's how it came out of the gate. Then a lot of the promises that were implicit in the solution failed as well. We couldn't keep our doctors. 5 million people couldn't keep the health insurance plans they had. It was promised to be affordable. Premiums in many states have gone up 50%. In Arizona, they've gone up over 100%. Deductibles have gone up 60%. I hear from a lot of people. I got a letter the other day from a gentleman, Livonia. He said, my health care, I have a health insurance card. I don't have health insurance, though I can't afford to use it. The impact on rural hospitals has been dramatic. I think 100 rural hospitals have closed. Insurance carriers are leaving the exchange, so a third of Americans are in counties where there's only one choice, so there's no competition. Troubling statistic to me is the administrative costs before the Affordable Care Act was put in place was $400, not the health care costs. It was $400 a year to administer a covered individual. It's now $1,800, so that shows you what kind of efficiency the federal government brings to these issues. And so we got to do something. It's not affordable. It's not working for many Americans. But that being said, we got 4.1 million Americans that are now covered because of Medicaid expansion, the moving from 100% to 138% of poverty. We've got young adults now covered on their parents' plan up to 26. And the most critical for many people is the pre-existing condition, which is now part of the coverage. We have to come up with a solution that will provide for all of those elements to continue. And the whole thing has to be predicated on making health care more affordable. And so we're working on a plan. People are very concerned, and I understand health coverage is critical to everyone, but people are very concerned that the Republican-controlled Congress is going to repeal it and then not come forward with a replacement. Our plan, I can promise you two things. We will read the solution before we vote on it, and the rollout of our replacement will go better than the rollout of the Affordable Care website, and it will not be disruptive to people who are relying on it for coverage. And we understand the importance, and we talk about it every day here, and I appreciate the question. I hope I answered it, but I think the elements that are critical are the pre-existing conditions, the coverage for young adults to continue on their parents' plan, and the Medicaid expansion, which is very important to 4.1 million Americans. Here's the results for our first poll question. Do you think the country's heading in the right direction? 34% said yes, 57% said no, and 9% were undecided. So kind of a mixed reaction there. Okay, let's go to Richard in Troy. Thanks for calling in tonight, and what's your question?
Well, good afternoon. I certainly agree with some of your last two callers about the education system is broke. And we know that kids in a private school, even homeschool, can get a better education. So I think DeVos can certainly tackle that. But my question is probably way out of the box. There's certainly a lot of unrest in our country, okay? And there's certain factions behind that. And, of course, the media doesn't say anything about it. And we know that George Soros is devoting billions of dollars to keep this unrest going, and it's kept quiet. And I don't know what any of the politicians, certainly on one side of the aisle, if anything they can do about it. It's that in the United Nations, which is another unrest for the world. And I know this is kind of out of the box, and hopefully we're getting to the point where we can defund the United Nations, our part of the bill. I don't know if you tackle it.
It's a great question, and last Congress I served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we had a number of hearings about the UN, and as you know, the United States pays a larger portion of their annual expenses and operating costs than any other nation. And it often seems like the UN is working against the United States. And Nikki Haley is there now. I think she'll be a strong advocate. I think she's also someone, though, if given the opportunity, can be persuasive and convince some of the members of the Security Council to at least consider our point of view. But it's with President Trump in the White House, I think it's going to be a different experience at the UN, and I hope that we don't see any votes like we did towards the end of the president's administration, where he was working against our ally Israel. So let's go to thanks for the question. Let's go to Kevin in Novi. Kevin, thanks for calling in, and what would you like to talk about?
Hello, Dave. Well, I actually had a few questions as this went on, but the primary one was recently President Trump signed an executive order kind of walking back the fiduciary rule in pension coverage and 401k plans. And I was just wondering, because you stated in your opening statement that your constituency is your most important, is representing them is the most important to you. I'm just wondering how you feel about that, considering he's walking back on a lot of the, it's consumer protection, and it's a lot of your constituents have 401k plans that are going to be put at risk now. So.
Yep. No, great question. So, and I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, press *3 so you can get in the queue to ask your question. So I supported the rollback of the fiduciary rule in the previous Congress. We passed a bill. I think it was Tim Walberg's bill from Michigan, and I supported that bill. I support the president's executive order repealing, pushing back on the fiduciary rule, and here's why. And we actually came up today in a Financial Services Committee hearing that we had this afternoon, and the Democrats in the committee were critical of the president's executive order, and their reasoning was that fiduciary rule prevents small investors, particularly in rural areas that maybe aren't close to a financial district, from being taken advantage of by their financial counselors and advisors. I don't think the rule does that. I think the rule it makes it financially impractical for those small financial advisors to make a living. And so if you, my chief of staff is from the Upper Peninsula, Chase Manhattan and Bank of America aren't going to set up an elaborate financial office in Escanaba. And so what you'll find there in Escanaba is you're going to find an individual financial advisor trying to provide advice to his neighbors and friends, his or her neighbors and friends, and the fiduciary rule made that impossible for that person to continue in business. So I think the repeal was a good thing for investors because it will make the advice and counsel of those advisors more accessible. Now, this past administration under Obama, we saw more regulations than we saw in many presidential administrations combined, and that's really even if people don't agree with President Trump, here's what's going to be interesting to see play out. His goal is to pull back on a lot of regulations and shrink the size of Washington in a dramatic fashion, because it's his belief, and I share this belief, that the incredible burdensome regulations from the Affordable Care Act to the different rules coming out of the Department of Labor to the CFPB and the financial sector and what they've done has really stymied our growth, and that's why we have 1.6% economic growth. If he's right in that bet, in that calculation, and our growth rate goes to 3 or 4% as he's promised, and businesses start growing and investing capital and hiring people, then we're going to have a lot of successes for the American people, and a lot of people are going to have opportunities to get good-paying jobs, get good raises, educate and provide for their kids' family and their education, and so that's really, for me, that's what this next 4 years is about: is can we get our economy moving at a rate that really gives people a shot at the American dream? And I think the best way to do it is two ways: get rid of some of these onerous regulations, and then also reform our tax code, which I'm happy to talk about if people have questions. Let's go to our second survey question, and just want to get some feedback on some legislation I recently introduced. The legislation requires a comprehensive inspection of the 64-year-old Enbridge Line 5 under the Straits of Mackinac. This line moves 23 million gallons of oil a day under the Straits of Mackinac. As you may know, the currents up there are very dramatic. If there was ever a spill like there occurred on Line 6B down in Kalamazoo, it's estimated the cost to our economy and the cost to our Great Lakes would exceed $20 billion. Are you concerned about the pipelines under our Great Lakes? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, and 3 for undecided. And while you're doing that, let's go to our next question. And Candace in Auburn Hills, thanks for calling in. What would you like to talk about?
I I just wanted to say thank you for supporting the president.
Your response has been registered.
I'm looking forward to hopefully like about a 20% cut in government so we get to pay less taxes. That's what I'm hoping for. So thanks.
Well, I think a lot of people would love to see that, and he's promised to work and simplify our tax code and get rid of some of the loopholes. And candidly, the challenge is going to be, and this will be interesting to see how this plays out. But we have $20 trillion of debt today, in a few years, you put that in the proper context. The interest on our debt in a few years, less than 10 years, I think about 7 or 8 years, is going to be $900 billion a year, which is more than our defense budget. So the interest payment on our debt is really what I'm most concerned about. But the challenge for President Trump is going to be to reduce people's taxes so they can keep more of their own money and invest in our economy and invest in their kids' futures. But he also wants to spend $1 trillion to deal with our aging infrastructure. He also wants to improve our defense, which is in a sad state of affairs. And so it's going to be, if we do get 3 or 4% economic growth, like I talked about a minute ago, then we'll have plenty of money to work on infrastructure and to reduce people's taxes. If we can't get the economy moving at a faster clip, then it's going to be hard to do all the spending that he wants to do to help our country's infrastructure and our defense, and also give the tax breaks that people so desperately need. So just want to be real candid about it, but that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Let's go to Elizabeth in Waterford. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you, Congressman, for caring about our opinion. I'm very concerned about spending millions or billions of taxpayer dollars for paying for the wall on the Mexican border. How do you feel about this?
Well, it's a great question. So, and it's certainly something that's created a lot of acrimony, among people in our country who disagree about it. So the wall is estimated to cost $14 or $15 billion. So that's an awful lot of money. My hope is from a practical standpoint, if you look at the 2,000-mile border to our south, which is, as an aside, which is much more secure than the border to our north, which is important to Michiganders, but we can talk about that another time. But the border on the south is about 2,000 miles. There are parts of that border that it's really impractical to build a wall. And so I know President Trump is very much dedicated to keeping his campaign promises, and I think the building of the wall is an important one because he talked an awful lot about it. But at some point, he's going to have to come forward and say, gosh, in parts of this country, the wall doesn't make sense either because of rivers or huge valleys and mountains, and so there are other methodologies. There are electronic surveillance. There are drones. There are fences. There's other methodologies. I do think we need to secure our border, and people disagree on that. But I think my grandparents were immigrants. They came through Ellis Island. They went through a process where they had to provide evidence that they had a job and a place to live. And just forget the terrorism risk, which I don't think can be dismissed. It's estimated that there are about 400,000 people that come in through the Mexican border illegally every year. If you just calculate that out and assume that the benefits for whether it's education or social services or health benefits or perhaps even our criminal justice system, the cost, let's say, is $20,000 a year. If you multiply that out, in 2 years, we'd have $16 billion. So from an economic standpoint, I think we need to secure our borders. We need immigration. Our country is built on immigration and built by immigrants. But we also need to follow the law, and I'm looking forward to having the laws enforced, and I'm hopeful that once we take some steps to restore some order regarding our immigration process, that some of the rhetoric, very divisive rhetoric, can dissipate, and we can start to work on productive ways to improve our visa system. Because, I'll tell you another story. I visited an engineering firm in Troy recently, and the guy told me, I just opened up an office in Barcelona. And I said, oh, that's outstanding. That's great. Congratulations. He said, well, it's not outstanding. He said, I couldn't find the engineers here. and I have so much work, I had to go someplace where I could hire the people. So we need immigrants, but we also need to secure our borders. Thanks for calling in. Let me give you the results on our second question. So not surprisingly, 82% of the people are concerned about pipelines under the Straits of Mackinac. 7% were not concerned, and 11% were undecided. So thanks for that feedback. Let's go to Mike in Wixom. Thanks for calling in, Mike, and sorry you've been holding for half an hour.
Hi, thanks, and I'm a regular caller to your office, so I'm quite familiar with you and your voting. You mentioned earlier in an answer that you were talking about the partisanship that's in gridlock that is in Washington, and part of the problem that I see, and I've made this known to your office, is that we have a need for term limits. If we had term limits, we could help drain the swamp, so to speak, as Donald Trump says, and we need we wouldn't have as much long-term problems. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are on endorsing term limits, and also what I'd like another question I have is, why can't we get some kind of legislation about the appalling news media and their biased news that they put out there with fake news and misreporting stories, and also the fake news that's prevalent that just gives a biased, one-slanted tilt to everything?
Well, both great questions. So let's take the first one first, term limits. And so I would be supportive of term limits, and we have them at the state level, as you know. It's complicated to pull it off here in Washington because we have to amend the Constitution, which in our 240-year history has only happened 27 times. So it's difficult under Article 5 to amend the Constitution, but I would be supportive of term limits. In my first campaign, my opponent, Bobby McKenzie, at a debate was asked how he felt about term limits, and he said he supported them, and he would support term limits, which required members of the House of Representatives to leave after 6 years. I think that's too short. I'm back here in my second term, so this is my third year here. I never served in public office before, so I had a pretty good learning curve here my first 2 years. And I feel like I'm in a position now to do some good legislative work and certainly have a better understanding of how to help our constituents on Social Security issues and IRS issues and our veterans. And so I feel like I'm better positioned now than I was 2 years ago when I was getting lost in the tunnels under the Capitol, right? And so I think 6 years is too short. I think you got to figure out the right time frame so that when someone loses their passion for the job, that's when they got to go. And obviously, everyone's different, but I think 10 years, maybe 15 years. But I think we would be well served with term limits because, as you well know, what happens is people get a name recognition, and so the power of incumbency becomes almost insurmountable. That's why 97% of the incumbents get reelected. And so I think after a period of years, people should be required to go back home and work there. And if you think about our founding fathers, that's kind of what they intended. This is supposed to be a part-time job here because in 1800 there was no air conditioning, so no one was staying here during the summer with the humidity. And they were all farmers, and they'd go back home and work their farm. That was their primary responsibility. So it doesn't hurt to move people out. To that end, I have introduced 2 bills so far. I introduced them the day after I was sworn in January last month to help drain the swamp. And I sent a note to the president, and don't know what he'll do with it. But the first bill requires that any member of Congress, after they leave, right now they're prohibited from lobbying Congress for a year. My bill would increase that to 5 years. And then for any member of Congress who leaves, they're prohibited from lobbying for a foreign government for 10 years. And I've seen firsthand here people, after a few terms, start to figure out what their next gig is going to be, and they try and cash in on their service in Congress, and that's not what it's supposed to be about. So anyway, I appreciate the call. Hope I answered your question. And you asked a question about the news media. I think the one consequence of President Trump taking on the media is I think they're feeling increased pressure. All media, conservative, progressive, it doesn't matter who it is, Fox, CNN, MSNBC. I think they're all feeling pressure to make sure their stories are accurate and And I think that's a good thing because people really do have their opinions shaped by the the 24-hour news cycle, and so it's important we're getting accurate information. Let's go to Barbara in Novi. Thanks for calling in, and appreciate you holding on so long.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, and I didn't expect the call back, so I appreciate the time to be on the phone call. And I do have a question. Of course, listening to others, I have more. One of my things was I have heard President Trump talk about a wholesale rollback, just an arbitrary number of like 50 to 75% of regulations. And I'd like your thoughts on things that we do need, like environmental protection, because we know about Flint water and rivers and coal burning and all sorts of things like that. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which you brought up, the rollback of the Dodd-Frank law, which helped consumers get some refunds, and Wall Street regulation. I've heard things about FDA, the person who's proposed as to be head of that cabinet position has a real anti-everything. So that my first thing is your thoughts on taking a hatchet to regulations or being very smart about it and looking for unnecessary things, because I think we do need some protection. And you can't. There has to be balance from unregulated businesses running rampant, and we're just individuals.
Right. It's a great question. So I'm not anti-regulation. I'm just in favor of good regulations. And so one of the concerns I have is the growth in Washington. And today there are 277,000 people that write and enforce rules in Washington. The regulatory burden on people and businesses has never been greater, and I think that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why our recovery has been so sluggish. That being said, I think President Trump, when he said a week or so ago, my plan is to get rid of 75% or more of the regulations, I think that's candidly an unrealistic expectation. So I don't think you'll see that kind of rollback. But I think some of the regulations, especially under President Obama, were intended to empower bureaucrats. And you mentioned the CFPB and Dodd-Frank. So, I know firsthand that banks, we lose a community bank a day. I met with the community bankers when I was home, and they said we have to sell our bank because we can't, we have to spend $2 or $3 million a year dealing with the regulatory burden. Well, again, if you're in Detroit or in Grand Rapids, you're going to find Chase or Wells Fargo or Bank of America. But if you're in a smaller town in Michigan, that community bank is pretty important. And today, not only are we losing a community bank a day, there's no one starting community banks. It's impossible. So I think we got to figure out a way to roll back some of the regulations, do it in a way that doesn't hurt people, and gives people, like under the solution that we're looking at, for example, to replace Dodd-Frank, the penalties for the bad actors that take advantage of people or don't follow the law, the penalties under our solution are far greater and far more severe. And I think if people play by the rules, then they should be able to build a business that they can make money. They can. One of the big problems with Dodd-Frank is the CFPB, if you're a good person, you're trying to do the right thing in business, they wouldn't give you any guidance. They wouldn't tell you how to comply with the law if you had a question because there was an ambiguity. They would want to just try and let you do it and then catch you afterwards. And I think people should be able to go to the regulators, get some clear direction, follow the law, deliver good value, make a living, and build a business. And if they circumvent the law, then I think the penalties should be far more severe than they are today. Let's go to Amina in Troy. Sorry to keep you on hold so long.
Oh, hi. It's nice talking to everyone tonight. I just wanted to thank you very much for helping my daughter. I had called your office, and you or some of your people had helped her get her Social Security disability that the government had held up for 10 months. She had already been approved, and they held it up for almost a year. So thank you very much, and I approve of Betty DeVos. I also am glad that we have President Trump has taken care of our country. We have someone who loves our country instead of someone who hates it. Thank God. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad we're able to help your daughter, and thanks for calling in. Let's go to Sandra in Commerce Township. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I did just want to mention or comment on your statement about Pelosi not having read the Affordable Care Bill Act bill prior to passing, and just I wanted to make mention that that's not uncommon because that, for example, the Patriot Act was passed before many fully read it. So I just want to make that comment. I also wanted to say that I just have a simple question for you. Are you committed to your party, or are you committed to the people who put you in office? And then can you recall a time when you ever opposed your party?
Sure. Well, that's another great question. And as an aside, on Pelosi's comment, in her defense, I think the bill was 2,900 pages long. So I doubt, I'm not sure a lot of people read the bill, even if they had it beforehand. But so your question is a good one in that people, I think what you're getting at is people come here and they kind of lose perspective on why they came here, or why people elected them to come serve, and they get caught up in trying to serve the party and not the people. I think I've put the people first. I think at a very simple level, we built a good constituent operation that, as you heard a minute ago, are helping people with problems. And I, will tell you candidly, having never served before, I wondered, well, when a constituent calls up and they're fighting with Social Security or IRS, or they got immigration issue, which are the more tougher issues for us to make a difference on, or maybe it's a veteran who's not getting the health care we promised. I wondered 2 years ago if we really could help those folks, and I'm happy to report that when we get involved and we call our liaison at the IRS or Social Security or the VA, certainly we do get good results. So I feel like that, that's candidly day in and day out, that's the most gratifying part of the job, because I feel like, well, maybe we didn't solve our national debt today, but we helped some veteran get what he has coming. As far as my votes, one vote that comes to mind is I got a lot of pressure from the party to raise our debt limit last year, and I didn't go with the party. And on some of the trade votes that were coming up, I didn't go with the party the way they asked me. So I think I'm voting my conscience in my district, and I'll continue to keep that in mind. And I appreciate your question, and hope you think I am, and hope you'll write to me when you think I'm forgetting why I came here. So thanks for the question. And let's go to Kevin in Troy. Thanks for calling in.
Congressman, how you doing tonight? And thank you for allowing us the voice on this conference call.
I love these teletown halls because unlike a lot of meetings, where you don't get to as many people, so I feel like you keep plowing through these questions, I can hear a lot more what people are thinking. So thanks for calling. Kevin, go ahead.
I have a question about the proposed NAFTA renegotiation, but I also, like a lot of people, wanted to make a comment, if you don't mind. I wasn't very much in favor of Betsy DeVos, and while I agree that the president, no matter which party they're in, have the right to nominate somebody for their cabinet positions, I think I, like a lot of people, may not agree with your statement that they have the right to have whomever they want in there. I think that it should go through a careful vetting process, and I'd hope that this process that we see where each party tends to do the same things to each other when the other's in power gets worked out a little bit better, and I'm sure you'd like to see that too, so that we actually have a real civil conversation about what's best for the country for a nominee, rather than short 5-minute question sessions for some of the people that went through. So in regards to NAFTA, though, could you talk a little bit about what your expectations and possible roles you think you may have in any renegotiation for that, and how you think that aligns with your vision for what you'd like to do for our community here?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I mentioned a minute ago, the one trade vote where I didn't go along with the party, and there were two votes actually. There was one vote and then one potential vote, but on the TPA agreement, I'll get to NAFTA in a minute, but the president came to Congress in the spring of 2015, and he wanted trade promotion authority to go negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership with 11 other nations in the Pacific Rim, and I thought the president should have the authority to go negotiate, and I candidly didn't think he would come forward and negotiate TPP as quickly as he did. But then I had some very strong concerns about TPP, and ultimately wrote a letter on behalf of the delegation to ask the president not to take up TPP right during the presidential election. My concern was the lack of currency protection in TPP. I thought that potentially Ford, GM would get hurt by the lack of currency protection and the unwillingness of Japan to make those concessions. So, and then, of course, now Donald Trump has pulled back on TPP and pulled out of it. But on NAFTA, I don't claim to be an expert trade negotiator, so I'll leave it to the president's trade representative. But I don't think it hurts to take a look at NAFTA and make sure it's working for Michigan families and Michigan workers. And a lot of companies have made decisions since NAFTA was implemented, so we have to be cognizant that we're not abruptly disrupting business plans. But at the same time, I think to reopen NAFTA and make sure it's still working for Michigan, I think is a good idea, and I support it. And I hope that the president will engage in a productive way in that process, so it doesn't become something that is not good for Michigan and Michigan jobs, frankly. Thanks for your question. I hope I answered it. Let's go to one last question. We're bumping up here on 7 o'clock, and George from Commerce had a question. Troy had a question.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for taking my call. I know there's been a lot of talk, and you get a lot of questions about Obamacare, but I wanted to voice my opinion and say that I don't think that the law is working for families here in Michigan, including my family. Because I remember President Obama, he was claiming that the premiums would be declining, but the premium for my family actually has gone up. And in Michigan, I know that the premiums are expected to rise by 17% this year, which isn't as much as some of the other states that you had quoted earlier, but in any case, it's still not really affordable. In addition to that, my deductible had gone up $500 this year. And so I know that the law is hurting my family, and I'm sure it's hurting others as well. You answered a bunch of questions earlier, or I should say a couple of my questions earlier about some things with Obamacare. So my question now is, since Obamacare is clearly not working, how do we, being IEU, replace this law with something that actually lowers the cost? And I guess I'm looking at it and I'm thinking I'd rather see something based in the free market, not necessarily government spending money on more programs. You mentioned about the budget or the deficit and how deep in debt the country already is. So the last thing I want to see is more government spending on programs. So I guess I'm just looking for a little bit more direction and some more detail on how this is going to work.
Sure. Well, it's anyone who tells you it's not complicated is not being truthful. So the replacement and to accomplish everything we want to do is complicated, but there are ways, I believe, to improve on the current situation that a lot of people are experiencing with the Affordable Care Act in terms of its lack of affordability. Some of the ideas are increasing competition across state lines, which would also necessarily involve an antitrust issue, but we got to tackle that and make sure that there's as much competition as possible. We need tort reform, so doctors aren't ordering tests just in a defensive posture to avoid being sued. We certainly need to work on pharma and drug pricing and make sure that's not adding to the cost of health care. We need to put in place health savings accounts and continue to expand that opportunity for people to make their own decisions about their health care. We need to redefine the essential benefits as provided for under the Affordable Care Act. For example, when we had to get our plan, I told my wife, good news, we have pediatric dental care. Well, all of our kids are in their 20s, and my wife didn't think that was a good reason to have a fourth child. So we need to make sure the essential benefits as defined is not unnecessarily adding to the cost. We need to provide for tax credits so that the health care that people have is portable, and and we have the ability to have people use health care however they deem fit. So I hope I answered your question, but it is a complicated formula to Obamacare imposed almost $1 trillion of taxes on the American economy and American people. We're going to pull back on that, but we need to make sure, even when we take into account dynamic scoring and the improvement in our economy and revenues that will come from that move, we need to make sure we have the resources to do the things I mentioned earlier, which is cover pre-existing conditions and deal with the Medicaid expansion. So let's take one more question, and while I'm dealing with the last question, let me give you a poll question. And my team here had a different poll question, but I'm just curious, so I vetoed that poll question, and I came up with my own. And so it's a pretty simple one, and I bet people will have strong feelings about this, but I'm curious what people are thinking. And the question is simply, should President Trump stop tweeting? 1 for yes, 2 for no, and 3 for unsure. And while you're pondering that, let's go to Bob and Troy. Thanks for calling in, and sorry you pulled so long.
It's okay.
Your response has been registered.
I'm calling because of 2 things. First one is, when Social Security was implemented, priesthood was included, but the nuns weren't. Is there some way that can be fixed? Getting them into the thing, all the other foreigners and all kinds of people that are on there that never put a penny into it and never helped people in this country. I think they deserve it.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just something that I think should be fixed.
Yeah.
They live from day to day. They don't have jobs. You know, they take an vow of poverty, but they still should have some money to live on.
Well, you've asked me a question that candidly has stumped me. I didn't know that was a problem, or that the nuns weren't eligible for Social Security. I find that to be surprising. I will tell you my own. I went to parochial schools for a lot of years. And I was a hyperactive kid, so the nuns were pretty tough on me, but they still need to get Social Security. So if you could stay on and leave your name and number, we'll look at it and find out the answer to it and see if we can get an answer. But that doesn't seem right to me either. And let's go to our last question, and then I'll give you all, just to keep you hanging on the poll results here. I've got them. I'll give you the poll results after our last question. Jeannie in Birmingham, thanks for calling in.
Hi, this is Jenny. Sorry.
Oh, Jenny, I'm sorry. Okay, Jenny.
Okay. Congressman, thank you so much for taking my call. I really do appreciate it. I think, like many Americans, watching what's been unraveling over the last few weeks, it's making us exhausted. For me personally, it's also making me terrified about our national security, and also this appearance of a bromance between Putin and President Trump. I am very concerned that we are headed into something that is dangerous, and that President Trump seems to be approaching foreign policy in a very haphazard way, attacking many of our alliances and people that countries we've had good relationships with. I would like to know your position on what's going on in this environment, and what is going to be done? What will Congress do to rein back some of this absolutely ridiculous and inflammatory rhetoric?
Well, that's a great question, and boy, a lot of good questions tonight. So I have the same concerns. Putin is a thug. He's a murderer. I didn't really agree at any level with the president's comments to Bill O'Reilly about, there are a lot of murderers out there. The moral compass for our country, we're not perfect, but we're in a different league, in far better place than Russia and Putin. And you just need to look at what Putin's been up to. So, Putin's economy is in shambles. And so his strategy has clearly been, over the last several years, to create international hotspots to distract his citizens from their economic problems, and to create a nationalistic support and fervor for his continued leadership. Crimea comes to mind. His actions in Syria really undermined U.S. policy and interests. He's putting pressure on the Baltics and creating problems there. He's putting pressure on the European Union, which directly affects our relationships and economy. So he's a bad actor. I don't quite understand President Trump's position on Putin and Russia. Now, to your point about what are we going to do about it, so you may recall Bush 43 and then President Obama after him both came in, and Hillary Clinton famously hit the reset button with the Russian ambassador, and kind of in hopes of a better relationship. Both the past two presidents before Trump kind of came in with an attitude that we're going to work with Putin, and I think he took advantage of both presidents, Bush and Obama, in that regard, and frankly got the upper hand on him. I hope Trump doesn't make the same mistake. Trump's attitude towards Putin is far more gracious than even Obama and Bush's was. And so to your question about what are we going to do about it, I think having served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm completely confident here in the House that Chairman Royce, a Republican from California, plans to hold hearings to drill into what Russia's up to, what hacking they did into our elections, and whether President Trump's attitude towards Russia is in the best interest of our country. And he will not defer to President Trump just because they're of the same party. And I expect Corker in the Senate, who's chair of the Foreign Relations in the Senate, to do the same because John McCain and Lindsey Graham are going to demand that he do that. So I think the Republicans in Congress will look closely at our relationship with Russia and look at some of the president's insouciance towards Russia with a skeptical eye. So thanks for everyone's questions, and I hope I answered your question. And here are the poll results. So not surprisingly, 66% of you think that the president should stop tweeting, 29% said no, and 5% were unsure. And let me conclude by thanking everyone for joining me this evening at the TrottTeleTownHall. I enjoyed answering your questions and hearing about the issues that are of concern. If we did not have the opportunity to answer your question, please stay on the line, and I'll make sure you receive an answer. Once again, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. And good night, and stay warm. I guess it's raining back in Michigan, so stay warm, and please let me know if we can be of help. Thanks again.
Town Hall Connect has ended.
Thank you for participating in our telephone town hall today. If you have any remaining questions or comments for me, please leave your name and telephone number after the tone.
Why'd you want her to call? Annika called on one of these phones, okay?
It's okay. She calls and just says she's there. It's fine. Are you done with my phone?
Yes. It's so important. Oh, give me this.